This week's Farm Basics is brought to you by satshot.com. Satellites aren't just for NASA anymore. Use the power of satellite imagery to create variable rate management zones in your fields. To reduce input costs and increase yields on your farm, go to satshot.com.
Well, whether you're a farmer or not, if you hear the term Roundup resistant weed, well, most of the population understands that Roundup is a product that kills pretty much every plant that's green. It kills everything out there. If there's weeds that are resistant to that product, Roundup, this sounds a little bit scary to me that, wow, is this some kind of super weed, or is it an extraterrestrial weed that came out of space or something? Why are certain weeds resistant, and is it something to be feared?
Well, first of all, when we talk about resistance, there's a big difference in my book between resistance and tolerance. And what that difference is, okay, normally it takes, let's say, a quart of Roundup to kill a weed. If now it takes 2 quarts of Roundup to kill a weed, but the weed is still controlled, I would call that tolerance. That weed is more tolerant than another weed that would die at a lesser rate. With resistance, what we're really talking about there is no rate of Roundup will kill that weed anymore. So there really aren't a lot of truly Roundup resistant weeds across the world or around the world, but what there are is a lot of very, very tolerant weeds. So you might get control now with 1 gallon or 2 or 3 gallons of Roundup, but you will at some rate get control of that weed.
Well, the term I like to use is economically resistant. And once you have to use 1 gallon or 2 gallons or 3 gallons of Roundup per acre to control a certain species of weeds, that becomes economically resistant, where you say, boy, I can't spend $40 an acre trying to kill a weed. There are other alternatives that I can use. And fortunately, with all the weeds out there, there is some type of chemical that will kill them. It may not be Roundup. You may have to switch to a different mode of action or a different active ingredient to get the job done.
And that's really what farmers are talking about when they say, I need to manage resistant weeds. Resistance management on the farm basically means rather than using Roundup, followed by Roundup, followed by Roundup, followed by Roundup, incorporating some other herbicides in there, whether that would be pre-emerge herbicides or post-emerge herbicides, whether that would be making a separate application of a different herbicide, or just mixing something in with the Roundup. That way you've got something else out there that could kill that weed, and if a weed did become tolerant or even resistant to Roundup, if that other herbicide is used, well, then that weed is dead. And you know what we always say, a dead weed can't be a resistant weed.
Well, the way I look at it too is, let's say that you have 100 weeds out there. If you can take 2 shots at killing those weeds, maybe you put a pre-emerge soil applied herbicide down and then you come back and spray something post-emerge later. Well, if you could knock out, say, 80% of the weeds with your first pass through the field, now there's only 20 weeds left. And even if you don't do the greatest job, if there's only 20 weeds, if you kill 18 of them, there's only 2 in the field. You did a 98% job throughout 2 passes. Now, if you're going to try and do it all in one shot, here's where we end up with issues. Sometimes weeds get too big, they have too many growing points, and all of a sudden you don't have a lethal dose to kill that weed, and that plant can build up some tolerance or even resistance to the product you're trying to use.
Yep, so we see more problems with weed resistance, that the plant will start to genetically mutate if it's hit with low doses of a herbicide. In other words, non-lethal doses of a herbicide. It starts to build tolerance, and then it passes on that tolerance to all its offspring, all the seed that go out. And where resistant weeds usually start is you spray a whole field, you leave just a handful. Well, those are the toughest weeds to kill. They are the ones that all go to seed, and after just 3 or 4 years, you have a lot of those weeds. So it could also be called a weed shift. In other words, it's very easy for Roundup to control, let's say, green foxtail and yellow foxtail, but it's almost impossible for a normal rate of Roundup to control wild buckwheat. So a lot of farmers now, where they're spraying mostly Roundup, they've got a lot of wild buckwheat. That's just what ends up building up over time because you just can't kill that weed.
Well, whether you have a farm or you just have a lawn or a garden, look at your weed control every year. If you're not killing every single weed, evaluate why. Did I wait too long to spray? Was the weather poor? Or is the product I'm using just not that effective on the weeds that are left? If that's the case, switch products for next year or make some changes so you do control 100% of the weeds, or you may end up with a tolerant or resistant weed in your area.
Well, speaking of controlling 100% of weeds, you'll definitely want to do it if you have our Weed of the Week. We'll tell you what it is later in the show.